So there's a new Vacation movie, which, judging by the box office, you didn't go to see, but it was pretty much a remake of the original Vacation in premise, if not necessarily in plot, in which the Ed Helms dad character is actually Rusty Griswold all grown up. However good the new movie was or wasn't, one thing was always for certain: it was going to be an occasion for reassessments of the original classic. After all, National Lampoon's Vacation is a movie whose legacy often feels weighted down by subsequent, tangentially connected events. In its day, it was a titan, a big Hollywood comedy starring probably the biggest comedy star of the moment under a branding that was, if only for a moment in time, as welcoming to audiences as the Marvel insignia is today. But time marches on, and in many ways it hasn't been overly kind to Vacation. Viewed from today, it's easy to see the film scarred by the receding of Chevy Chase as a comedy figure of note, the increasingly negative critical reappraisal of the legacy of screenwriter John Hughes, and, ironically enough, the fact that by now its actual legacy has been pretty much eclipsed by its second sequel, Christmas Vacation, becoming much more popular as an unironically beloved multi-generational holiday classic. But the original, the uncomfortable fact about many classics of the 1980s is that uneven distribution of product in what were then the new inventions of cable television and home video could make pretty much any film in the sweet spot of being both recent and readily available to watch a staple of the broad mass media diet regardless of its actual merit. Couple that with how ubiquitous the franchise, and particularly Chevy Chase, would continue to loom in the popular culture, and you have a valid argument for at least the possibility that Vacation isn't really deserving of its place on the pedestal. Sure, it's remembered, it's referenced, it's acknowledged as a quote-unquote classic, but are we just standing on ceremony at this point? Is Vacation a genuine comedy treasure, or just a collection of funny scenes elevated by nostalgia and connection to a later, much more beloved institution? Should it remain enshrined, or does any level of close inspection destine it for the same ash heap of dubious repute on which now lay the once unassailable statures of Ferris Bueller, Police Academy, and even the early Farrelly Brothers films? Is National Lampoon's Vacation really that good? If you've seen the show before, you know that there are greater depths, intended or not, to Vacation, and we're gonna find them in the subsequent segments. But at the outset, the foundation of this is pretty goddamn simple. National Lampoon's Vacation wants to be funny, and it is enthusiastically, deliriously, screamingly, laughing so hard I'm crying and might actually pass out, hysterically funny.
Where's my old car? She can't weigh more than 100 pounds.
Oh no! You can't put her up on that roof!
Yes, he can. The dog went on the picnic basket.
These feelings make you do things you wouldn't normally do.
Like swimming naked with girls?
Yeah, like swimming naked with girls. Well, not with girls. You think I was swimming with girls?
No, that's bad. I mean, we can't close our eyes to the plight of the cities. Kids, you noticing all this plight? This'll just make us appreciate what we have. Roll them up.
Or perhaps you don't want to see the second largest ball of twine on the face of the earth, which is only 4 short hours away.
I don't know why they call this stuff hamburger helper. It does just fine by itself, huh?
This one.
What'd I tell you? Funny is funny. Sometimes the basics are really basic. The best argument for Vacation as a great film is that it's meant to be a comedy and it's funny. That's kind of it in terms of base surface level critique. The film has one job, to make you laugh, and it gets that job done with aplomb. As befits its primary influences, i.e. the National Lampoon, director Harold Ramis, and star Chevy Chase, it's constructed as a series of sketch comedy style vignettes tied together by a story conceit of a road trip. Almost all of them are funny, and a few select ones are really funny. If you go back through it, there's hardly any dialogue that isn't a setup, a punchline, or a non sequitur. Almost every reaction is a take of some kind, almost every voluntary action has elements of physical humor, and every frame is jammed with some level of visual absurdity. Case in point, it's funny enough that the Griswolds are going to be stuck in an ugly-looking car for their big trip, but Vacation chooses to stick them with a monstrosity designed to be the ugliest car imaginable.
Clark, is that the right car?
No, it isn't, honey. I changed my mind.
They flattened our old car like a pancake.
Is there a second, really obvious, singular reason that Vacation is as good as it is? Yes. Chevy Chase. Now, I know his star has faded in recent years. He didn't seem to appreciate that Community will end up having been one of the best things he's ever been a part of. In the backstory of almost any project he has been involved in, he doesn't come off well. Other, more intellectually appreciated comedians take shots at him, and his cameo appearance in the Vacation reboot was, sadly, just kind of, yeah, sad to watch, but it can't be denied. Once upon a time, Chase was a force of nature in American comedy. His filmography isn't exactly spotless, but when Chevy Chase was on, few stars burned more brightly. And while I'm not sure Vacation is his best performance in his own golden age, that honor probably still goes to Caddyshack. It absolutely is the most demonstrative of just how good he was in a pure effort up on screen, show your work sense. This is very much a one-man show where Clark W. Griswold Jr. is the focus of nearly every scene and the target of almost every comedic misfortune, which means Chevy is always on, always working, and always riding the lightning of a character who is very much on edge himself. Now, for those not aware, Vacation screenplay is inspired by the National Lampoon short story that made John Hughes as a comedy writer, Vacation 58. In that version, the story is related from the perspective of the child Rusty Griswold character, while hapless patriarch Clark's Job-like suffering and increasingly unhinged endurance becomes the story's comedy centerpiece, but also makes time to observe the strange behaviors of the other travelers. The movie, along with moving the action from 1958 to then present 1983, and we'll talk more in depth about both the short story and that perspective shift in the next segment, fixes onto Clark as the POV character and almost never breaks from it. We see the kids at the pool, Audrey scoring some weed, Rusty reading porn, Ellen talking to her cousin, etc., but otherwise 98% of Vacation is Clark's story through Clark's eyes, and it's an incredible comic performance. Yes, this movie is in fact the rare occasion where ignoring all other possible relevant viewpoints in favor of the upper middle class straight white suburban guy actually was the best creative decision. The key is that Clark isn't a typical situation comedy dad figure. He's not the straight man beset by a chaotic family of the 40s and 50s. He's not the lovable dumb lug of the post-60s sitcom era. In fact, what Chase does throughout Vacation is so unique it's kind of hard to summarize. The closest comparison I can think of is Peter Sellers as Clouseau in the Pink Panther movies, but slightly more oblivious and without the shield of a funny accent or cartoon-like resistance to most physical injury. Clark W. Griswold Jr. is an idiot, but he's an idiot of a very specific disposition. He's exactly smart enough to be aware that he's stupid, but also exactly stupid enough to think he can conceal this fact from everyone else around him, and we can see how he does it. He smiles, he stands up straight, he dissembles, he rolls with the punches and his own constant trip-ups by laughing, taking deep breaths, saying patently false things matter-of-factly, and immediately moving on to some other distraction. His default answers to every question are essentially, I meant to do that, and it's supposed to be like that. He's at once king and jester, a man so confused himself that he thinks he can gaslight the entire world, and we see it play out from the get-go as he gets rolled by the sleazy used car guys.
I'll get to the bottom of this.
Yes, Mr. Ed.
Mr. Griswold ordered a blue sports wagon. Where is it?
I don't know, sir.
I know what must have happened. It didn't come in.
Ed, I'm not your ordinary, everyday fool, okay?
And subsequently tries to roll his family about the ridiculous wagon queen himself.
Why is it still running?
Oh, all new cars do that. I'll take care of that in a second. You may think you hate it now, honey, but where do you drive it? Whoa, an airbag!
Vacation's triumph, then, is taking basically one joke, let's put this high-strung buffoon on the banal Americana road trip from hell and see what it takes to break him, and understanding that because of what an unusual specimen Clark is and how spectacularly good Chevy is at playing him, that really is enough. But even a singularly great comic performance can only carry a movie so far, and while drag a funny character to one funny location after another and see what happens can ideally give you a series of fun sketches, if there's no greater theme, meaning, or depth to unify and elevate the narrative, thus strengthening the film's bond with its audience, you don't have a movie people will internalize and want to revisit. Telling a joke is a skill. Telling a joke that people want to hear again when they already know the punchline, that's an art.
Well, how old are you, little one?
She's born without a tongue, Clark. But don't you worry about her. She whistles like a bird and eats like a horse.
And here we go with the always popular, never tedious cultural and socio-political context stuff. Strap on in. As mentioned, John Hughes' original short story Vacation 58 differs from Vacation in that the events are repeated by Rusty Griswold in the form of an archetypally matter-of-fact how I spent my summer vacation essay, involves a road trip to the actual Disneyland instead of the movie stand-in Wally World, and takes place in 1958. Otherwise, the two narratives follow a fairly similar series of events. The film's darkest joke, the accidental dragging death of the dog, is actually taken wholesale from Hughes' original text, with two noteworthy exceptions. One kinda uncomfortably racist part where the Griswolds are briefly lost in the ghetto in the story.
Pardon me. I wonder if you could tell me how to get back on the expressway.
Hey, fuck your mama.
Thank you very much.
Is a super racist part involving an Indian reservation, and the ending. Whereas in the film, Clark finally outright snaps at finding Wally World is closed for repairs, uses a toy gun to force a security guard to take his family on the rides, confronts a police detachment, and ultimately manages to talk Roy Wally out of pressing charges against them, in Vacation 58, things go a little bit differently and a lot more dark. In that original ending, the enraged Clark 1.0 instead tracks Walt Disney himself down at a Beverly Hills garden party, pulls a gun, and shoots the father of Mickey Mouse in the leg before being tackled by police and dragged off screaming to prison, with the rest of the family reacting not all that put out to be rid of him and heading home much more comfortably via air travel, which is how that Clark had wanted to do the trip all along. Yowza, that's dark.
This is my wife, Ellen.
Hi. We're really big fans of yours. We watch your show all the time.
Oh, and my children, Audrey and Rusty. Nice family.
Finally, whereas the movie's setting of 1983 made it contemporary, Vacation 58 was written and published in 1979 as a dark, cynical takedown of the writer and presumed audience's own well-soured baby boomer nostalgia. Specifically, it's Hughes fictionalizing the road trip vacations of his own childhood. Now, let's be clear about our American comedy history here. Cynical takedowns of well-soured baby boomer nostalgia effectively accounted for nearly all of 1970s hip comedy. If you were a comic in your late 20s, early 30s, and you weren't writing or performing material about how the American dream mythology of your childhood was a bunch of tacky plastic bullshit barely concealing a pitch-black abyss of all-consuming nothingness, you probably weren't working the hip clubs, writing for the hot publications, or pitching to the hit shows. It was the life spring of comedy in that moment in time. And if nothing else, in Vacation 58, John Hughes presented the single purest distillation of that particular comedy mindset possible, pulling a gun on Walt Disney, and by extension, the entirety of the perfect all-American post-war nuclear family ideal that Walt Disney did more than anyone else to lionize and propagate. However, like so much else in American culture, the comedic self-inflicted puncturing of boomer nostalgia also came in two distinct flavors marked by the perspective of each individual retrospective. Most overwhelmingly, you had flavor number one, the perspectives of or appealing to mostly white, heterosexual, middle to upper middle class men, see Second City TV, Saturday Night Live, and most definitely the majority of writing staff for humor magazines like the National Lampoon, and flavor number two, everybody else. Now, why is that differentiation important? Well, both flavors were organized around using humor to expose, undermine, or even completely tear down the false idols and sacred cows of the idealized 1950s American dream mythology that loomed so large over the childhoods of these now adult boomers. But the reason behind the rage was night and day, whereas flavor number two, aka everyone else, was mainly invested in ripping apart that mythos to expose how propping up the lie of the American dream had contributed to their own oppression, marginalization, and life struggles. Flavor number one's comic perspective was generally coming from a different place, namely disappointment that the lie of the American dream was a lie. It's the humor of institutions not working well enough versus the humor of institutions working just well enough to succeed in their function of grinding your life into paste. To use a crude but illustrative analogy, a typical flavor number two joke would be about Aunt Jemima being an uncomfortable co-opting and mass market standardization of the immensely problematic Mammy caricature, whereas flavor number one would be more likely to find humor in disappointed memories of how Mom could never get those damn pancakes to be as good as they looked on the Aunt Jemima box. Or, if you want to get really blunt about it,
Okie dokie. How's this?
We're talking about comedy deriving from anger at the existence of privilege versus comedy deriving from anger at privilege not delivering on its promises. The gun in Vacation 58 is not being trained on Walt Disney because the ultra-capitalist post-World War II ethos he stood for as a Hollywood mogul, industrialist, and hardline anti-communist contributed to the economic disenfranchisement of the inner city. It is not being trained on him for helping to culturally reinforce the rigid nuclear family gender mandate that locked a generation of women into housewife mother roles whether they wanted to or even suited to them. And it is not being trained on him for the damaging ethnic caricatures in his early cartoons, which undoubtedly wreaked havoc on the psyches of minority youth who grew up seeing themselves as punchlines instead of heroes. And just so we're clear here, Walt Disney happens to be a hero of mine, so please fuck off in the comments section. No, Vacation 58 imagines Walt Disney taking a bullet in the leg, because a middle-class white suburban family and, on a meta level, the kids standing in for the writer of the story, did not ultimately have the kind of vacation to his theme park that had been promised to them as their God-given right as rule-following, mold-fitting, Disney-consuming perfect nuclear family.
We watch his program. We buy his toys, we go to his movies. He owes us. Doesn't he owe us? Huh? He owes the Griswolds, right? Fucking A, right, he owes us!
Not saying this is a bad or unworthy perspective to come from in terms of humor, just establishing context. But what does that context have to do with the movie and the previous establishment of Chevy Chase's version of Clark as a figure within it? Well, I'm glad you asked. Firstly, it's no accident, in fact it's a vital component, that the movie swaps perspective from son to father as part of its translation from nostalgia flashback short story to contemporary viewpoint movie. Vacation is a story that relies on the familiarity with the material to the teller for most of its energy and momentum, and the guys who would have been Rusty's in 1958 would very likely be Clark's 25 years later in 1983. And what was going on with real-life Clark W. Griswold in 1983? Well, remember in our Die Hard episode when we talked about that guy you can't talk about 80s pop touchstones without mentioning? Yep, here he is again. When Ronald Reagan and the quote-unquote New Right swept into American political power in the 80s, they didn't get there by conjuring a new Republican majority of old-timey corporate fat cats and country club douchebags into existence. They did it by tapping into and slyly co-opting an unexpected new cultural zeitgeist that had everything to do with the baby boomer men who were angry enough at the revealed falsehoods of their decidedly unideal childhoods to tell or laugh at dark jokes like Vacation 58 a few years ago, but were now feeling a little different. Basically, as a plurality of boomers in the Clark W. Griswold mold found themselves entering their 30s and acquiring families, houses, mortgages, and all manner of other immediate grown-up stressors, the emotions centered on things like disappointing childhoods evolved from anger to melancholy. Cackling with vengeful glee about how phony and bullshit the idea 50s, 60s Disney-fied American family lifestyle sold to them by Madison Avenue was rather quickly giving way to a renewed, more wistful version of nostalgia and a new follow-up thought. Yeah, that stuff was fake and phony, but wouldn't it have been nice if it had been real?
When I was your age, my dad shared a beer with me, and I thought it was about the best thing in the world. Yeah. When I was a boy, just about every summer we'd take a vacation. And you know, in 18 years, we never had fun.
And poof, there was the Reagan Revolution waiting in the shadows to whisper a Mephistophelian offer in their ears. Who says that just because it wasn't real, you can't make it real now? You're the adult now, right? You've got the money and the say-so and the power. Why not make that American dream you were promised a reality for you now? And for your kids. Now, there was a serious dark side to that, which we'll talk about in a moment in the spot where we usually talk about the dark side stuff. For now, what's important is that the broad strokes of that idea represent instincts that are almost overwhelmingly positive in theory. Take hold of your life and build your own ideal reality. Give your children a better life than you had. And Chevy Chase as Clark W. Griswold Jr., however tragic, comical, pathetic, and fumbling he is otherwise, is the living embodiment of that very instinct. This is a man who, despite his obvious, to no one more so than himself, intellectual shortcomings and all too human foibles, is putting everything into making his American dream real. Remember, we've established that Clark is a not-that-bright buffoon doing a 24/7 I meant to do that, fake it till you make it dance, but who or what did you think he was doing it for?
I guess I've missed an awful lot. First, I didn't want to take this vacation. But now I'm glad I did. It's given me a chance to spend a lot more time with you and,
Audrey.
Audrey.
It's certainly not for himself. The events of the film clearly demonstrate that Clark lacks the self-awareness necessary for a self-preservation instinct. He's doing it for them, as he understands it at least. All of that clenched fist, false-smiling, lump-taking, bullshit-enduring bravado, that's for Audrey, Rusty, and Helen. Clark Griswold has no earthly business being anyone's husband, anyone's father, anyone's alleged adult, and yet he has managed through sheer force of will to get there. A man who can barely walk down the street without encountering some calamitous pratfall has built a life for his family that looks an awful lot like the ideal American dream of his and all the other Clark Griswold's youths, and now he's going to take them on the ideal American vacation of that same youth, an old-fashioned family road trip to Disneyland, and he's going to do so with the same ridiculous, absurdly unflappable, misplaced confidence through which he's achieved everything else.
I just had a good talk with Rusty. You'll be in good hands here, honey.
Where are you going?
Oh, there's got to be a phone or a gas station around here somewhere, honey.
Taxi! 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 Dead. I'm dead. Taxi!
And however pathetic, sad, self-inflicted the stumbles of his journey are, he really does hold fast the whole time, even as it becomes apparent that the all-American family road trip is exactly as much of a hellish, fake, tacky falsehood in 1983 as it was in 1958. Clark is going to will the joy he was promised into existence. To call his endurance Job-like sounds like a joke at first, but it becomes gradually apparent that Clark's suffering is indeed damn near biblical, complete with encounters with sloth, greed, the specter of death, temptation, and even an ordeal in the desert. In the end, it's all just simple, too dumb to quit bullheadedness, but by the time Act 3 rolls around, it's hard to see Clark's madness as anything other than perversely heroic as he marches his family up to the gates of secular consumerist heaven, and upon finding it closed to them, reveals that not even secular consumerist God is going to stand in his way.
Let's just find a hotel. I'll call my parents, they'll wire us some money, we can fly home and forget this entire vacation ever happened.
Which leads to the final revelatory deviation from the short story. Vacation 58 was all about Mark I version of the later 20th century American dream being pulled down and exposed for a lie by newly adult boomers, and as the killing blow, the ultimate false idol of the era, the proud patriarch who most assuredly does not know best, going out in a blaze of myopic, self-immolating revenge and subsequently blinking out of his family's life, from whence he is evidently not to be missed. But Vacation's story is being told by, for, and about approaching middle-aged boomers trying desperately to become the perfect dads they themselves never got to have, and so Clark's story ends as happily as it can given the circumstances. Instead of a real rampage that's all about selfish pride, he fakes the actions of a truly desperate man and does at last succeed in giving his family their day at Wally World. Oh, and hey, Roy Wally, aka Walt Disney, aka the face of the lie of old-fashioned all-American family himself, shows up to let the Griswolds off the hook, and it turns out he too was just a decent guy trying to do right by his family all along.
Oh, hell yeah. Chef, one took the whole clan to Florida one year. Worst 2 weeks I ever had in my life. The smell from the back seat was to unbearable. I mean, a family.
I know that smell. I know that smell. But Roy, can you imagine how your kids would have felt if when you got to Florida it was closed?
Oh, they don't close Florida. No, you.
Well, I know they don't close the state of Florida.
How about that? 50s dad and 80s dad are, together, restored to a confident sheen just in time for the credits to roll.
Forget it, officer. I'm not gonna press any charges. Out!
Huh? Did I tell you? What did I tell you? Did I say trust me, huh?
Does this ending make a lick of sense? Is it at all probable? Does it even fit the decidedly more grounded, realistic tone of the rest of the entire movie? Hell no, but who cares? By this point, the audience and the characters have earned their happy ending. Clark W. Griswold Jr. improbably comes out having gone from adult making a heroic effort to something like an actual hero, the martyr through whose suffering an entire generation of fumbling, try-hard dads have been redeemed. Who could possibly take issue with that? Well, let's get it right the hell out there. The whole scene where the Griswolds are lost in the hood is uncomfortable as hell, not just in a this wouldn't fly today way, but in a this shouldn't have flown period way.
What if these guys know the Commodores?
You're gonna go all the way down about half a block, and you'll see a Torino with no wheels on it. Now inside that Torino is my cousin, Jack. Now you tell him you my boy and that you lost. And he'll make sure you get the way you're going, because you don't want to know from me, man. This ain't even my neighborhood.
Now look, yes, the main victim of the joke here is Clark. Ha, he should have known better than to do this. But here's the problem. The gag only works if you accept a scene logic that street crime is somehow endemic natural state to black people, and therefore getting your car stripped if you park in a black neighborhood should be a what did you think would happen obvious head slapper, like getting bitten if you jump in a shark tank.
Kids, you noticing all this plight? This'll just make us appreciate what we have. Roll them up.
Yeah, even by the metric that pretty much any movie from before 1998 or so is going to be offensive to modern sensibilities in some way, it's an ugly bit when you get right down to it, and it doesn't really go with the rest of the movie energy-wise. However, a broader related undercurrent of punching down humor does pervade the rest of the film to a more subtle but noteworthy degree. You'll recall that I mentioned that there was a dark side to the Reagan-era forced rebirth of the American dream narrative that informed Clark's characterization, namely that the way the Reagan Revolution planned to facilitate the economic conditions that would allow and encourage white suburban boomer dads to try building a modern, working version of the idealized 50s family life inevitably involved making things worse for, oh, how about that, everyone else again. Sure, Reaganomics supercharged the economy in ways that worked out great in the short term if you happen to be Caucasian, living adjacent to major cities, but not in them and had disposable income to throw around, but it did so by shifting priorities that left the inner city to flounder, slashing benefits and programs that blighted whole swaths of the country, and dropping regulations that prevented corporate America from befouling the air and water, which they soon resumed with aplomb. As such, it's a non-explicit but nagging element of the narrative that Vacation is basically the story of the beneficiaries of Reaganism touring the uglier costs of Reaganism and inviting the audience to laugh at what they see. Ha-ha, minority neighborhoods are a nightmare war zone. Ha-ha, Eddie's family is depressingly poor. Ha-ha, America's road trip tourist traps have decayed from kitsch into calamity. Ha-ha, whole regions of the impoverished American Southwest have descended into a Mad Max-style post-apocalyptic feudalism.
Your sheriff think of your business practices.
And remember, the Griswolds aren't driving through all this nonsense because they can't afford to fly or something. They're doing it to scratch Clark's itch for an old-fashioned family road trip nostalgia, and they can afford to take a bunch of days off from work. This is the kind of thing that isn't conscious or the movie's fault, but, you know, there's enough of it that it's understandable if not everyone finds it so innocently hysterical.
Sit down and shut up! Move out of that seat and I'll split your lip!
Beyond that, well, there's no ignoring that on a technical level the film is kind of sloppy. It's easy to forget given how quickly this particular group of this particular generation of comedy people became superstars, but this was only Harold Ramis' second time in the director's chair after Caddyshack, and that movie had been an infamously irresponsible drug and lack of oversight-fueled production where pretty much everything from the pace to the structure to the actual plot had been found in the editing process and bore little to no resemblance to the film those involved actually set out to make. Now, by comparison, Vacation is a much more conventionally structured film with a more deliberate narrative flow from one set piece to another, so there's not as much noise, chaos, or variety to help hide that he was still very much learning as a technical filmmaker, though he did get much better. The film's direction isn't bad so much as it's rough around the edges. Scenes go on too long, compositions look off, editing for scenes that don't involve elaborate physical comedy often feels lazy, over and under lighting issues plague the exterior scenes, and things rarely get dynamic unless it's time to directly reference a shot or technique from another movie. Sometimes the ragged nature of the film helps. The shooting is technically amateur and rushed-looking enough that the grimier, seedier parts of the trip almost feel like a trashy drive-in movie is about to break out, which feels rather appropriate, but a lot of the time things just look cheap and make you wonder if they only had one usable take. Finally, while going back over the film made me feel more strongly than ever that the characterization I ascribe to Clark in this piece is supported by the text very strongly, there are a scattering of moments where he does come off as more of a typical 80s movie entitled asshole. And yeah, I think there's a sliver of truth to the idea that the annual omnipresence of Christmas Vacation has somewhat warped the cultural perception of the entire franchise, and the original film especially, particularly in the way that film's justly beloved attic scene, the sole moment in the entire series where the veneer of satire and mockery drops completely away, makes explicit the nobility and sincerity at the heart of Clark's conviction that this original film only hints at in the margins. Indeed, would we still be talking about this franchise if not for that installment? I honestly can't say. I only know that in order to write this, I had to watch that part of Christmas Vacation a few times, and now I need a minute. So, Vacation is occasionally shoddy-looking, dated, socio-politically problematic, and not the standout entry of its own continuity or even any of the main talent's filmography. So is it actually any good? Yeah, it is. No genre demonstrates the strange alchemy of filmmaking, wherein technically perfect work can be a snooze, and a shambling succession of mistakes can be an all-time classic like comedy. By the evidence, Vacation should not work, and yet it does. It does very well. Like I said at the beginning, the fact that the film is almost obscenely funny makes up for a lot, and the noble idiocy of Chevy Chase's conception of Clark makes up for the rest. The majority of the jokes land hard, the overall themes of redemption, nostalgia, and the compulsion to carve out a minuscule ideal of personal happiness in a world built to deny the same makes us care just enough to invest in the journey beyond waiting for the next pie to hit Chevy in the face. And ironically enough, nothing has crystallized that fact recently better than seeing the 2015 reboot approach the same basic material without that key element of an overarching core theme and realizing how much of a difference that absence truly makes in the negative sense.
Just beautiful. Oh, darling. You made it.
So yes, Vacation is sloppy, flawed, and very much overrated in the grand scheme of 80s comedy. But it's a good movie that frequently nudges over into being a great one, and you're not imagining how much you liked or even loved it. It's a sour confection with a note of sweetness that's just edgy enough to hold up, but earnest enough for me to have just used a fucking food metaphor and not feel like a total hack about doing so. What else can I say? National Lampoon's Vacation is really that good.
And if that mockingbird don't sing, he's gonna buy me a diamond ring. And if that diamond ring don't shine, it's gonna surely break his heart of mine.
And yes, we probably will do Christmas Vacation later in the year, so, settle down.